All right, good morning, or nearly good afternoon. Thank you so much to everyone that stuck around for the panel discussions, where we plan to take a bit of a deeper dive into two of the chapters specifically from the OECD report. Thank you also to the OECD for producing such a detailed and insightful report, one that's likely to spark the kind of meaningful dialogue we need to move South Africa's economy forward and retain some of the growth lost over the past. The timing of this report is significant. South Africa's post-pandemic recovery, as we saw in the presentations, has been slow, and recent GDP figures and forecasts don't show a strong indication of a rebound. The headwinds we face, whether global or homegrown, require steady, evidence-based responses. And it's exactly in this context that insights and recommendation in this report are so valuable. At ERSA, Economic Research Southern Africa, for those of you that don't know, our mission is to support economic research that supports and informs growth-promoting policy, or at least policy making. We aim to cultivate a network of scholars and policy practitioners who are not only producing high-quality work, but who are also engaged in shaping the national conversation. Reports like this align closely with that mission. They don't just provide answers, they raise new questions, challenge assumptions, and invite broader engagement from researchers and decision makers alike. Importantly, studies like this give us the opportunity to bring people together, to test the findings, to add depth, context to the discussion, and to think through the practical implications of this work. These conversations help to ensure that evidence translates into an insight, and that insight informs policy, which is ultimately our goal. It is in that spirit that we've convened today's panels to reflect, to debate, and to build on the invaluable foundation laid by the 2025 OECD South African Economic Survey. We are truly grateful for the great work that has been done, and we are really grateful to the panelists that will be joining today. As you might have seen from the program, we'll have two panels. The first panel would be the one that's next up. Will be around Chapter 1 of the OECD report, which is specifically around macroeconomics and economic growth, with the deeper context of structural reform. We are fortunate to be joined by three excellent panelists with us for this session. Mamokete Lijane is a strategist in global markets at Standard Bank and chair of the ERSA board. She is one of our own. She's a regular columnist and a sharp commentator on South African monetary and fiscal policy. Mamokete also serves on the Presidential Economic Advisory Council and brings a thoughtful, market-orientated perspective to our conversation today. Khetha Dlamini is Chief Director of Fiscal Policy at the National Treasury, where he has served for over a decade. Khetha brings both practical experience and policy depth, and his long-standing work in the public sector has given him a front row seat to the country's fiscal evolution over time. And then finally, for the first panel, Professor Phillipe Burger, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences and Professor of Economics at the University of the Free State. He also leads the macro-fiscal workstream of Treasury's flagship SA-Tide research program and has written extensively on macroeconomic and development issues, including scholarly books, textbooks, and numerous academic articles. Phillipe is truly one of the strongest bridges in the country between academia and policymaking. Our second panel, which I'll introduce now as well so that I don't have to come stand here again later, who will join us after lunch, will focus on Chapter 4 of the report, Reforming South Africa's Electricity Sector. This is one of the country's most urgent challenges, as we've all discussed today, both in terms of stabilizing the present and enabling future growth. We're joined by four speakers who offer a rich mix of perspectives across government, academia, policy, and technical systems. Trudy Makaya is a senior advisor at the Boston Consulting Group, a former economic advisor to President Ramaphosa, and a current member of the PIAC. of the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee. She brings insight from both the public and the private sectors, and it brings a strong understanding of the strategic dimensions of energy policy in South Africa. Professor Kenneth Kramer is an economist at WITS with graduate degrees in law, finance, and economics. His work spans fiscal and monetary policy, competition, labor markets, and crucially for today, energy policy. He also serves on the PIAC, in addition to the Ministerial Industrialization think tank, where he was appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry. Thirdly, we have Professor Rula Inglisi-Lotz, who is an ERSA Fellow and Professor of Economics at the University of Pretoria. She is a C1 NRF-rated scholar. With over 80 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, Rula is leading authority on energy economics and environmental policy in South Africa. She is the founding president of South African Association of Energy Economics and currently serves as vice president of the International Association for Energy Economics. And then finally, Dr. Ansuya Rungasamy is the only non-economist on our panels today. She holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Pretoria and currently serves as the technical advisor on power sector reform. The just energy transition and capacity building efforts in South Africa in this space. Her systems expertise is vital to grounding our policy debates in the technical realities of implementation. Both of these panels will be moderated by Antony Altbeker, who has generously agreed to take this role on for both. Antony is technical advisor at the National Treasury, focusing on fiscal policy and public finance reform. He has also worked on a range of other pressing policy issues, including crime, policing, unemployment, and economic inclusion. He brings a wide lens and a deep understanding of how policy is made and how it evolves in South Africa, given his long-standing relationship within the civil service in South Africa. So once again, thank you to everyone that's here today. We're grateful for your time, your interest, and your willingness to engage. We look forward to rigorous discussion grounded in data, enriched by experience, and focused on solutions. I'll now hand over to Lila from the OECD to start the panel off by presenting a somewhat deeper presentation on Chapter 1 of the report. I think while she's presenting, I'll welcome the panelists also to take their seats up on the stage, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for organizing this event. We are very glad to be here and to share the main findings and recommendations of our report. So, as Fouché mentioned, I will focus here on the main policies to overcome obstacles to growth. So, as you can see in this figure, which was also presented at the press conference, South Africa has shown some resilience in terms of GDP growth during the COVID crisis, and the GDP returned to the pre-crisis level in 2023. However, economic growth has been disappointing, with an average of 0.7% of economic growth. This was not enough to raise GDP per capita, which has been stagnating over the last 2 decades, as you can see in the right figure. While in the meantime, other emerging economies has caught up or even overtaken South Africa. So, an important consequence of low growth is that South Africa holds the lowest employment rate when we compare with OECD countries and big emerging economies, and the highest unemployment rate. So this means that many South Africans struggle to find work, and a lot of resources are not used. If we look at the contribution, the different contribution of potential growth, which is important, raising potential growth is key to increase growth. You can see here 3 main size facts. The first one, you can see that the contribution of capital to potential growth has declined over years and now has become tiny. The second important fact from that is that the contribution of employment has become negative over years. And the same occurred for labor efficiency. So in the report, we try to look at each of these elements directly or indirectly. Regarding the capital stock, we look especially at the public capital stock and how to improve infrastructure. This will be discussed more in the next session. We also look at firm dynamism, business dynamism, as a way to raise private investment and to create more jobs. And all these should also increase labor efficiency. So let me give you a brief overview of the findings in each of these elements. So, as I mentioned, the contribution of capital stock has declined, including public capital stock with a deterioration of infrastructure over years. So the first thing to do is to create fiscal space to increase this public investment there to stop the deterioration of infrastructure. You can see in the left figure that investment in South Africa is comparatively low when we compare with OECD and other emerging economies. And more importantly, you can see in the right that investment has declined over years quite significantly. And this occurred while spending increased a bit, or at least was kept at the same level. With a debt to GDP ratio at 77%, this means that the room to increase public investment by additional spending is limited. So there will be a need to create fiscal space from a bit where we stand. This involves higher efficiency in spending. This also involves stronger control of public spending and prioritization of public spending. These are elements that we discussed in the survey, but I can go back to that during the discussion. We'll see also room to create fiscal space for public investment by property tax revenue and VAT. Both of them are less distortive for growth, and they are below OECD average. And it's difficult to talk of public efficiency without also mentioning an important dimension, which is the fight against corruption. It's an important element because it puts a burden on public spending. And as you can see in this figure, where we compare the anti-corruption framework in South Africa with OECD in green and G20 average in the dotted line, we can see that South Africa is close to the center, which means that the framework is less efficient. So there are things to be done here, including accelerating prosecution. So the second element of our analysis, as I anticipated, is firm dynamism. Firm dynamism is relatively weak. This is evidenced by, first, the low share of total employment in SMEs. This is what you can see in the right, significantly lower than OECD, 10 percentage points lower, actually. The low business to entry, when we compare South Africa with 50 other countries, advanced and emerging. This is what you can see in the central figure. And even more strikingly, in the right, you can see that the share of adults who intend to start a business is very low, at 10% compared to 50% in Brazil or 40% in Indonesia. So weak business dynamism, how to promote that? First natural usual suspect is the product market regulation. Product market regulation compare country in terms of whether the framework promote or restrict competition, and you can see that in South Africa, South Africa ranks as the country with the stricter regulatory framework. Why this is the case, and how this what we can change to improve business dynamism here. So if we look a bit into the details, we can see that the first thing is that the license and permit regime is relatively strict, one of the strictest in our sample. This is related to the fact that in South Africa, for instance, you don't have a list of clear permits that are needed for a profession, which exists in other countries. You don't have a silence is consent rule, which means that the administrative process can be long, and you need to wait for the administrative approval, even if the time is long. You don't have a once-only principle, which means that the same document can be asked several times by several departments. And all of that complexify the way to do business and simplify that have proven to increase business dynamism. So another example of regulatory barriers is the efforts in communicating on laws and simplifying law. Here again, South Africa stand like a regime where this effort is performed poorly in that area. And provision that could be added in order to simplify business, doing business for firms is, for instance, to use plain languages in laws. This is, for instance, something which is required in some countries, or to have public online database. All that allow firms to be more aware of what they need to do in order to run a business and simplify their operation. Another important element I would like to mention from the product market regulation indicator is the high entry to professional services. So real estate, lawyer, accountant. We can see that here again in many professions, South Africa is in blue here. We are above the OECD average. And barriers to entry can be related, for instance, to the fact that there is only one way to qualify for a profession. There is some citizenship criteria in some professions, which is not always the case. Foreign qualifications are complex to be recognized in the country. So all that also reduce barriers entry in services. And easing that who have the potential to widen services and access to services for other companies. Another example, which I think is important also, is whether the public procurement provide economic opportunities to SMEs. This is less the case in South Africa, and there are several things that can be done in order to, like, for instance, dividing big contracts in small lots such that SMEs can apply. We can go into other details during the discussion. Last but not least, the insolvency framework. Insolvency framework are proven to be really critical for firms' dynamism because they are key to ensure a smooth exit of firms. And exit is somehow as much as important as entry. Insolvency framework in South Africa are not fully effective in that regard, which means that there might be some difficulty to exit. This is, for instance, the case when you have high personal losses in case of failure, which is the case in South Africa, where you can protect more entrepreneurs from that. You also do not have early warning system, pre-insolvency procedure really specific to SMEs, and there is also some room to accelerate asset recovery for creditor. So moving in that direction could be really helpful in assuring that resources go where companies are stronger, and this could help growth. So a second important element of our analysis is urban and housing policies. As I said, before, it's important to create more jobs, and we think that easing barriers to entry and easing regulation could help, but it's also important to ensure that workers can access them. So we see several barriers. Large urban sprawl, which is inherited from the apartheid. You can see in the left figure that which reports the build-up rate across country in cities. But South Africa's city tends to spread out instead of building up. This is reflected also in large settlements. Here, we recommend some pro-densification policies in order to gain from agglomeration gain and to also improve access to job, like easing restriction rules in cities, for instance, in terms of build-up, and promoting rental houses. Public transport is underused. It takes a long time when you take train or buses to go to work. And people use mainly minibus taxi, which come with several challenges because a portion of them are informal and they don't comply with regulation. It is also costly. It can absorb up to 40% of low-income earner wages. So we have several recommendations there. Without going into the details, let's say that the main important one is to strengthening and progressing toward more formalization of minibus taxi. This is the most used way of transport, so this needs to be fixed in order to comply with safety regulation, with emission regulation. There are several significant investment needs in infrastructure. It's important here to attract private investment, and the same appear for freight trains, where important investments are needed. And this requires also some better attractiveness for private investors and a change in market structure. So we can also discuss that later. So let me just finish this presentation on labor market policies. Here we haven't analyzed in detail this aspect, but we did an update. It was mainly analyzed in the previous survey, as Luis mentioned in the previous session. But we identify three main challenges, which refer first to easing barrier to hiring. Here we think, and there was a recommendation in previous survey, of easing automatic extension of negotiated wages for SMEs, because they tend to suffer more from that. Strengthening also worker security, ensuring that work pays. There has been the minimum wage introduced in 2019, but the enforcement is relatively low, so some efforts could be done there. And further supporting unemployed, including by reinforcing public employment services, which are understaffed, and strengthening ALMP's policies, active labor market policies. Let me say a few words briefly on informality. For those who were not there in the previous session. Informality is relatively low compared to emerging economies and close to the highest level in OECD countries. So in the survey, we ask whether we need to ease the access to informal job in order to ensure that people can grab all economic opportunities. What we say is not really to easing informality, but rather to make regulation for informal trade in particular easier, like making city zoning restriction easier and simplifying permits for informal trading. But we also push for formalization policies and easing formalization, especially through the tax simplified system that can be expanded to reach that objective. And lastly, in the context of the green transition, an important challenge that needs to be tackled by the authority is the impact on labor market, including the fact that coal worker, half of coal mining plants will close in the next 2 decades. This represents 1% of employment, the coal mining workers, but it's very concentrated geographically, so there will be a big geographic shock in Mpelunga region in particular. There will be also, the shock will be different according to the skills. Our research shows basically that transitioning from brown to green or grey jobs is easy or smoother for high skilled and medium skills, but it can be quite difficult for low and medium high. So some support are needed. Here we looked at other experiences, and our recommendation cover 2 dimensions. First, supporting job creation in mining region. This include creating some coal commission like Germany, fostering clusters in order to create some business dynamism over activities, and further supporting dismissed workers through an employment package to let people having time to find a job, supporting also their geographical mobility toward new regions, and strengthening ALMPs to provide career guidance, job search counseling in order to help them to find new type of jobs. So in that last slide, I summarize the different elements of our policy recommendation, which go from strengthening corruption, creating fiscal space, to reform regulation, strengthening urban and housing policies to reduce costs for workers, and some refining of labor market institutions. All that should support more investment in infrastructure and also more firms dynamism, which we think are the key foundations for stronger growth. Thank you very much for your attention.
when I saw the report, I thought perhaps my wife wrote it because it's a very long to-do list. So before we start, I'm not sure if there's any media still here. I'm also not sure if anyone's writing investor notes. Just a request, if you're going to quote anybody on the panel, please check the quote with them. Otherwise, Chatham House rules, if you don't mind. So the panel is macro-focused rather than the micro reform. But we will talk a bit about growth. So of course, panelists can chip in on the productivity and growth, the micro reforms that have been described and are described in the second chapter. But I want to start with macro if we can, particularly because that is the comparative advantage of the panel. And of course, the big macro challenge we have is achieving debt sustainability. And so I want to start with that. There's an old joke that I'm sure everybody knows about a tourist asking someone in Dublin for directions to Tipperary, and the guy says, well, I wouldn't start from here. I feel that way about fiscal debt sustainability as well. We're not in a good place. But let's start. I mean, the most important driver of the debt dynamics equations is the growth rate. It governs everything. So maybe we should just start with that. The report identifies a range of brakes on growth, effectively. A lot of them infrastructural, business confidence, lack of investment. But I would like to focus a little bit, I think, on the on our macroeconomic outcomes and the impact that they have directly and indirectly on growth itself. So, if I may, I'm going to pick on Phillipe to start with, but just to talk a little bit about the importance of growth to understanding the difficulties we have in achieving debt sustainability in South Africa, and what it would mean to resolve some of the challenges on the growth front for achieving some of the other critical objectives like macro sustainability.
Thanks, Antony. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be here. Yes, so of course, fiscal sustainability has been, or the problem with it has been with us for quite a few years, and we have almost a bit of a running joke to say that the debt GDP ratio is always forecasted to stabilize in year 3 of the medium-term forecast, but in a sense. And we were talking about that earlier. One needs to sometimes go back to what I would call the original sin. So we've been able to through expenditure ceilings to manage the growth in expenditure, but there was that initial increase in expenditure GDP that we saw in 2009, 10, 11, that phase, and it is as if we have never really been able to shake that off. So it's not as if the primary balance does not react to the debt GDP ratio. That's it does react, but it is making up that 2-3% gap every year, and that is what then feeds back into the debt. But I think very often when we talk about how to get a handle on this, we talk about, do we need to cut expenditure? Do we need to cut or raise taxes? And yes, we probably need to do a bit of both, but on the taxation side, it's limited. We've seen, in economic literature, there's something what they call fiscal fatigue. It is when you do react to an increase in the debt GDP ratio, but it gets weaker the higher the debt GDP ratio goes, because politically you just can't muster the necessary steps to take take these the necessary to take these necessary steps. I think the what we've now seen with the whole thing about the VAT budget 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. That's just one form of that, and Khetha was in the thick of it, so he'll be able to tell you way more about that. But I think so I do think that on the revenue side there's limited. I agree with the report that I think there's tax loopholes and so on. One can still close a number of them. I think where one might be a bit more constrained is in terms of things like the carbon tax. It's another tax.
Phillipe, can we come back to tax in a bit? Can I ask you specifically?
Yeah.
Are our macro fundamentals constraining growth?
Well, I think, yes. So the first thing I think that constrains it is the low investment GDP ratio. I think that is the one big number. I mean, in the last batch of numbers that came out showed that again. So the empirical analysis shows you that there is a link between private sector investment and growth. That you can, every percentage point that private investment GDP goes up, there's about a 0.6% increase in economic growth rate that you see. Given that ratio has been going down, that's a problem. The next thing then, we know that there is a link between, of course, economic growth and job creation. From 2010 to 2019, GDP on average grew 1.7%, and the increase in the number of people employed was also 1.7%. So there's a one-to-one almost relationship there. So that chain of causation from investment to growth to job creation is I think quite direct, and we've been saying, I mean, this is not really new. We've been saying this to each other for many years. I think the real question is, why is the investment not picking up? I mean, that's the other thing we talked about over coffee earlier. Is we thought in 2024 it's going to pick up. It did not. So I think that is the one thing. The other thing I think we need to also look at is in the budget. So and the impact that has on growth. I think the numbers that were cited here, government's own general government investment going down from 3.5% to 2.5% of GDP is playing a big role. The other thing we've seen that there is a negative relationship that you pick up between government consumption expenditure and growth. That ratio has been going up, and you can, you don't need to do a very sophisticated analysis to see that there's a negative relationship between those two things. So that goes to the productivity of expenditure and the impact that has on growth. So when we talk about changes in the budget to be growth friendly, I think that is bigger expenditure on government investment, but I also think the efficiency of what we would classify as consumption expenditure. We need to make a distinction there between more productive and less productive expenditure.
So I wanted to ask Mamokete, because I think Mamokete is mostly responsible for the low investment rate. Well, I mean, one of the dynamics we have in the economy is high cost of borrowing, high interest rates that are in some way linked to the state of our public finances. Are our interest rates too high for growth? And if they are, can we do anything about it?
Okay, so that's like such a loaded question because somebody has to be thrown under the bus. Yeah. So the interest rates are too high for growth. I think if you look at where the government bond yield is, and that'll be the risk-free rate. At the moment, we've got government bond yields that are somewhere in the region of 10.5 today. They're just on 10, but that's kind of the area. Inflation is 3%, and it's forecast to be 3.5 8.2 for the entirety of the year. That then suggests that in real terms, the rate that you're paying is 7%. Assuming, inflation stays here, but even if you go back to the inflation target of 4.5%, it still suggests that real terms you're paying 5.5% to 6% rates. That is very, very high. Regardless of what metric you use, whether it be where we've traded historically, whether it be where other countries are borrowing, etc. What we've seen as a consequence is that, from an investment perspective, the penalty for being in or at least the required rate for being in an investment has to, at a minimum, clear that hurdle. So that creates a very, very high base rate for the economy. For example, I remember when we initially had the REAPs rounds, the initial ones, and they'd mostly be, funded in inflation-linked space. And at the time, inflation-linked bonds were at 2%. So that's where the initial REAPs were funded. The ones that we have now are funded with a base real rate of about 5.5, and then you need to add another, 2-3% on top of that. And one of the things that guys were saying when we were initially discussing going into this round 2 for just after the crisis, I think, was that these rates are too high, and they've had to change the way they structure their deals just to take that into account. So that's just one example. But I would imagine that example reverberates throughout every other investment. And that is really, I think, a material constraint. So you've got rates at the front end of the curve. You look at the repo rate currently, 7.25, 8, whatever the case may be. But that's not where deals actually have to be funded. They're funded on the basis of the bond curve, and the bond curve is high.
And why? What can we do about that? I mean, are there policy interventions that we could take, or is this something we have to live with until we achieve fiscal sustainability?
So I think one of the things that Treasury has tried to do is, introduce, different funding mechanisms for infrastructure where you can provide different layers of security. But I think you just cannot run away from that base rate. So if you ask a fund manager, have you got funds? They'll tell you, I've got funds, but I can't find bankable projects. So from a bank perspective, from a asset management perspective, they'd much rather put that money in bonds because they're getting the real rate. Guys will tell you, if I can lock in myself at 7% real, I don't actually care what else is happening anywhere else. It's affecting equity markets. It's affecting, so that it really has a profound effect on capital allocation within the economy. So you've got to do something about where the government funds. And that is, I think, fundamentally a fiscal issue.
Speaking of which, Khetha, the OECD is recommending quite a strict fiscal anchor of an expenditure ceiling that grows no faster than inflation, or aggregate spending that grows no faster than inflation, which obviously implies per capita real reductions annually, and assuming positive growth, it implies the state accounting for a smaller share of GDP over time. You're in the heart of the beast. How hard would that be to do?
Me and a few other people in this room, so I might just throw it. Firstly, let me compliment you, Delia, on this report, which is a very well thought out report, and in particular the fiscal section, I think, reflects a lot of our thinking. You're right. I think we'll take this as an input into the discussion for fiscal anchors, which we've put out a discussion document. And as we've said, all views are welcome. So in the budget overview, we make a point about spending reviews. And the point that we try and make there is there are programs that are underperforming, and these should be candidates for at least rethinking them. And so that's one way I think we can start thinking about this particular recommendation. Obviously, a particular bugbear in the report does actually go into it, has been wage setting in the public sector. The point is that it is a tough rule that you've proposed, and I think people are finding out what we've always known. I see Michael over there, that budget setting is very hard, and now that it's come out in public, it's really hard. The report does say, though, that to establish sustainability, you need to be a bit more ambitious. I will say, though, that over this 5 years since the start of the 2020s, we've delivered quite a large fiscal adjustment. And since 2023, we have been delivering a series of primary surpluses that have been growing. So is it a stretch goal? It is a stretch goal. But we have, I think, demonstrated a bit more ambition, the ambition that you call for in this report, and I think we've demonstrated that.
Mila, do you want to come in? You look like you're eager to respond.
Now, just two quick reaction. So, I mean, we share your view. Interest rates are too high, and they are too high for two reasons, basically. And there is a risk of crowding out. So this is something that needs to be bring down. And the reason for which they are too high is a low growth perspective for investors and high debt. So this is why basically we recommend for low growth going through regulatory reforms, trying to make the most of that, and for high debt consolidating. There will be not any other way now if we want to reduce interest rate. And this linked to your reaction on the fact that what we suggest is pretty tough. Somehow you can see it like that because spending will increase at the rate of inflation, and there will not be increase in real term. However, and it's important, we suggest that it will be temporary. So it's not a permanent rule because it will not make any sense to impose a reduction for several years and not sharing of the real economic gains. So the idea is to bring the debt to GDP ratio stable and then declining. And I think the temporary aspect is really important. Sorry. Thank you.
So I'm going to throw a provocation, but just to defend myself in advance, my views are extremely orthodox, rabbinic almost. But there is a left critique of South Africa's macroeconomic policies. Phillipe, I'm going to throw this at you. I mean, there's two different left critiques, and I don't know which one is more serious than the other, or if that's even. But one is to say we should spend a hell of a lot more and damn the consequences on the debt ratio, and the other is that we should tax a lot more and introduce a whole range of quite fairly exotic kinds of new tax instruments. Why is that wrong? Or is it? I mean,
it's wrong. Well, the interesting thing is that those 2 points are often made in the same piece of work. So on the expenditure side, the issue is that we should spend more because we can depend on the expenditure multiplier. And then it basically looks at the debt GDP and it says, yeah, well, don't worry too much about the increase in debt because if you spend much more, the growth rate will pick up and then what's below the line will increase and the debt GDP ratio will stabilize. Well, we've tried that for 15 years. The deficits have not led to all this growth. And I think Constantine and the team has done quite a lot of work on the size of the multiplier and shown quite decisively that it is not big enough to do this. So I think that's the one problem. Of course, if that were true, then why limit the expenditure? Just keep on spending. Where is this limit? But that is never, it seems to be spreadsheet exercises, plug a number in and then see what pops up on the other side. So that is not, that's not the thing. On the revenue side, I think, we've seen an increase in the personal income tax rate a couple of years back. We've seen an increase in VAT, in the VAT rate back, when was it, was it 17 or something, 50, yeah. And that didn't deliver that much more revenue. So there's a possible Laffer curve effect kicking in there. So I think the more credible argument would be to say, let's look at the composition of expenditure. So, and I want to come to your comment about the temporary measures, because we have a lot of things that we know need to happen and we need to spend money on them because we have a constitution that highlights socioeconomic right realization, all of that. But we need to maybe say, okay, let's prioritize these things, not just in terms of A is more important than B, but also say, okay, when are we going to do this? So maybe B is very important, but we just can't do it now. Maybe we can, once things stabilize in 5 years' time, then we can revisit it. So I think we need to, when we look at our prioritization, it's not just what is important versus what is less important, but maybe the things that are important, at what point in time are they more critical? And then, so we need to bring in that intertemporal or intergenerational element in our allocation of spending too.
Khetha, I know you specifically asked me not to ask you about tax policy, but because you've just been through a bit of a ringer over the last few months around an increase in tax rates. Is it plausible? I mean, the OECD report focuses on on two areas. One is VAT and one is base broadening, primarily through tax expenditure reforms on the tax expenditure front. I think Phillipe was starting to make some comments about that earlier when I rudely cut him off. Is there room for? How does Budget Office think about these things? The space for revenue measures in addressing the debt sustainability challenges that we face?
So I think if you go through the documents, at least that we've published in this particular decade, so certainly after the pandemic, 2021, we've made the point that we are concerned about, further tax increases and its impact on economic growth. We'd rather see base broadening. However, as you saw in 2023, the size of the consolidation or the task of the consolidation and the size of the fiscal risk was such that we had to resort to something on obviously the borrowing side, a bit more spending. The most important thing that we're focused on right now is hitting that target. I know Phillipe just made the joke about the third year. It's actually this year, Phillipe, that we're actually going to achieve that. So that's our first perspective. It is true, and we make the point that the GNU dynamics are such that that lever of tax policy isn't one that we can pull as lightly as we could before 2024. I did want to make and I don't know if this is a bit of a non sequitur, but I did also take note of some of the spending suggestions that you make around infrastructure in particular. One is increasing the rate of infrastructure investment, and then again, to your point about TFP or labor productivity, also just making sure that regulations are supporting the delivery of infrastructure. That's one of the things that we're trying to deliver in this budget framework by making it easier by strengthening governance of infrastructure delivery, but also then making it easier to deliver those points. So that compositional element is being also then followed up by elements where we're strengthening governance of public spending. So it's hard. It's probably a lot harder. And if consolidation goes, if we have to consolidate a bit more going forward, it will be a tough case to make. But I think we'll be able to make the case.
So Mamokete, I noticed that in the business day today, you attempted to sway the panelists by trying to influence the debate about an inflation target. What's the best case against lowering the inflation target?
No, why are you asking that question that way? Like you're walking me into a trap.
Well, if you hadn't tried to influence the panel.
So, the best case against lowering the inflation target, I think, is that maybe with growth being where it is currently, and the sort of like not having momentum in terms of, reforms. I know we've done what we've done in electricity and it's been impressive, and it probably will be quite additive to potential growth for a long time. And we haven't even seen, I think, the bulk of that. But there are still areas within which our economy remains uncompetitive. And the best argument, I would say, is you would want to do it at a time where, your supply side constraints to growth were easing, because that would create the space to have growth that is in and of itself disinflationary, and that becomes almost not a costless exercise, but to some extent it is a costless exercise, which is actually, I think, was the situation in the 2000s when we moved inflation from 10 to 6. So that then becomes a lot less problematic from a political economy perspective, because maybe you have those output gains that you can sacrifice a little bit. And it's difficult to make the case that this is where we are. Last year, I thought that this would be where we would be this time this year, but growth is disappointing. So it's suggesting that, there are constraints from a global perspective, maybe. And so you wait a bit. That'll be the best case against.
So I'm going to ask Miller to come in, because the OECD report makes, and I think there's quite a lot of agreement in the room probably, that the target should be lowered. So why would we do that now? Why should we do that now? Sorry.
I think the survey starts from the following observation. First, this lowering of the inflation target is not a new thing. It has been on the debate since a while. It was initially the objective of the central bank. Now the inflation is broadly at the level that would be required if we lower inflation target. So this means that the cost will be certainly lower, because you don't have to establish a disinflation policy. So that said, I fully agree with you that there might be some supply constraint right now, and if the growth picks up, you might reach your target, which would be problematic. However, you have this band. This band is exactly done for that, to adjust to the economic cycle. So we think the risk is still reduced, and we also think that several reforms has been already adopted. So the bottlenecks on growth should be reduced, and will reduce. So these will be our main arguments, let's say.
I'm going to open it to the floor. We've got 15 minutes, but perhaps one final point on the chapter. The expenditure adjustment. Okay, firstly, the structural adjustment South Africa has to do is a very large structural adjustment. And it's a very challenging one, because there are also areas where we need to spend. So we need to maintain the social spending. We need to increase infrastructure spending. There's a lot then relying on controlling the public sector wage bill as a lever for reduced spending. And then there's some discussion about quality of spending, but a lot of that discussion on the quality of spending interestingly, and wouldn't want to be sort of as criticizing it, but the focus goes very quickly to corruption as a major reason why we have poor spending outcomes or inefficient spending. It is a challenge to figure out how you get that all right. Am I right? Am I overreading what the OECD is saying about the quality of spend?
Sorry. Thank you. A bit so. Let's say that indeed we start from the following observation. You have almost 60% of spending in social. And there is frankly not a lot of room to reduce that given the level of poverty. It's absolutely not conceivable to recommend to reduce that. You have 20% going on debt services. So it does not remain a lot. So what remains is the wage bill, the investment which has declined, and the transfer to SOEs. So what we recommend is three things. First, because what remains is the wage bill, and also because what we have seen is that the wage bill is particularly large, and not because of large head accounts, but because of relatively higher wage. Like you have the wage bill equivalent to above the OECD average, while you have, the wage bill is equivalent to OECD average, while the employment is above. And basically, it's the same as the Denmark with less employees, twice less employees. So here, there has been for long years wages increasing significantly more than inflation. So what we suggest is really not to cut across the board, let's say, but temporarily, again, if someone needs to carry the burden of that, maybe it is here to be done. The second important recommendation is linked to SOEs. So not directly to corruption. The corruption is the third one. The second one is increasing the efficiency of spending in SOEs. And this really relates to strong regulatory reforms, attracting more investment, increasing competition in all these network industries. And so this has the potential to increase the efficiency of spending. I think this is really where we can have the higher return from the reforms. So,
are there questions in the audience? I'm not sure if there's microphones. I've got two at that table, and then we'll come to the grey-haired middle-aged man at the back.
Thank you very much for the discussion, and of course, thank you for this very comprehensive report to the OECD. So, I have two questions. Perhaps the first one is for the OECD. So a number of charts that stand out, but just from your presentation, two in particular. The first one, again, for the OECD, is the chart that you showed on informality. And it really looks as if South Africa stands out like a sore thumb on your scatter chart on informality versus GDP per capita. And this is something that Haroon Borat has also picked up in some of his research, where we have very low rates of GDP per capita and at the same time very low rates of informality. Of those two metrics, which do you think we were underestimating? So do you think perhaps we are underestimating labor informality and hence underestimating the employment rate? So that's a specific question on the data. The second one is perhaps for the panel, and that was one of the very first charts you showed on the decomposition of potential GDP growth. I can make complete sense of the compression in the contribution from capital, but what I'm curious on is if there's any views on why labor efficiency has declined over a 20 or 30 year period. Like, what is behind that? If anyone on the panel has got views on labor efficiency and its contribution to potential GDP. Thank you.
Should we take two more questions and then the panelists can try and answer them?
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Spusiso Kumbi. I'm from National Treasury. I have a question also for the OECD colleagues. Andrea actually asked my first question, so it's great. The second question on the personal costs of failure for entrepreneurs. There's a very nice chart there. I'm interested, and I'll obviously read the report in more detail, but I'm interested from the OECD colleagues what drives that high failure of that. I'm interested in that personal cost of failure. And I think it was the UK and France, I just had to look quickly, on the other side of the spectrum, that had very low to little personal costs of failure. So obviously there's something there that we can learn from those parts of the world about limiting or at least eliminating those personal cost of failure to entrepreneurship. I think it's a very great point that you raised, that sort of entry is almost just as important, while exiting is just as important as entry. And I'm going to steal that phrase later, but we can talk about how much it'll cost and IP and things. But yeah, that's just my question. Thanks.
I think take the last question and then we'll answer. I think otherwise we'll start running late.
Thank you. I'm Michael Sachs. I think that this is a really helpful and useful report that the OECD has put out on a range of areas. But I just wanted to make a comment on the conversation, really, on the panel, that I think one of the commendable things that the OECD does is present us with a whole lot of analytics around taxation, which we don't get that kind of input on our tax debate from competent multilateral institutions very often. So it's very useful. And it's particularly useful because, as they rightly point out, overcoming the fiscal problems that are a constraint. If fiscal policy is a constraint on growth, then overcoming that constraint does require tax increases. So the kind of straw man of left critique that Antony set out, that tax increases are a way to kind of, as a macroeconomic policy intervention, that's not what I'm talking about. Just saying that because of our past behavior, not because of what we want to achieve in the future, but because of our past behavior, you will have to raise taxes in two respects. First, we have expanded the expenditure commitments. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that we're going to reduce those expenditure commitments, for instance, on a basic income grant, right? So either you're going to have to roll back the commitments to higher education and to a basic income grant and presidential employment stimulus and all the other things that are clearly at the center of government's program, or you're going to have to raise taxes. Right. The second reason you're going to have to raise taxes is because in a scenario, of course, if we're in a scenario where growth reaches 5%, and then we don't have any problems at all. But in a more realistic scenario, where South African growth returns to a moderate path, we are going to still be left with a massive debt overhang that is going to be reflected in very high and persistent debt service costs. And that imposes a choice on us. Do we deal with that debt overhang entirely by reducing spending or by raising taxes? So for both of those two reasons, Parliament has kind of come to the conclusion that we can't increase taxes now, but the question of taxes are going to still be with us for a long time. Secondly, the OECD correctly points out that the space for reducing spending is very limited, right? And because the reason spending is high is largely because we have extensive public services providing public goods to poor people. And it's very difficult and where there are inefficiencies in spending, such as, say, with the SETAs, fine, we all agree there's an inefficiency, but now the OECD is recommending a whole expanded program or identifies another big constraint on growth, which is the skills training system that we have, which is the combination of TVET colleges and SETAs, and recommends expanded investment in active labor market policy and skills development in order to overcome that obstacle. So whatever savings we must make in inefficient SETAs, the idea that that's going to finance a reduction in the debt, it seems like a bit of a stretch. So that's just my comment on the fiscal side. On the inflation targeting debate, I just have a question because I dabble in this debate. I'm not really, when I know a lot about fiscal policy, that's why I'm very conservative there. But when it comes to monetary policy, I don't know so much. So I tend to be a bit radical. But the question is, why? Because the strong, as Mamokete said, what's the strong argument against it? Now, the strong argument for it that seems to be coming out is we stick out like a sore thumb, right? It's kind of China did it, Brazil did it, we can also did it. Everyone else has these low rates, so for our competitiveness, we must align with these people. So my question is, why would a democratic society in facing major macroeconomic challenges choose to assign to price policy a macroeconomic adjustment that can easily be addressed with exchange rate policy? In other words, if we have a competitiveness problem, why do we see the solution to that as holding down domestic prices and so potentially undermining demand and growth? Whereas we can address this problem with exchange rate policy and depreciation and better targeting of the real exchange rate, right, in some sense. So why is it so important that we abandon this exchange rate mechanism, which, by the way, is the mechanism that democratic societies facing difficult social conflicts tend to use as a way out from these problems?
So there's a lot of questions. So I'm not sure exactly how to manage it because it's not a coherent list of questions. Mila, can I ask you to respond initially because there were some specific questions to the OECD. Maybe you could kick off with that, and then I'll let others jump in and add and respond to other questions.
Yes. So let me answer to the two first questions in that case. So informality, why it stands out? Indeed, there is low GDP per capita and low informality. I think according to Borat and also other study from Osman, it's not that we are underestimating the one or the other. This is not the way we look at it in the survey. The way we look at it is that informality is restrained more than in other countries. When you look at the regulation of informality, it's by far much stricter in South Africa, which we don't say is bad in general, because informality is not a good thing. Formal jobs provide a better quality job, better earning, better protection. So the first best is still having more formal jobs. But what we think, the explanation is really related to regulation. So the fact that it is difficult to register as informal, the fact that in cities, trade zones are really restrictive, and all that contribute to that number. Regarding the personal cost of failure, which was the second question for entrepreneur, the thing is that the question is, will you enter in the market, start a company, if when to set up your company, you need, for instance, to back your loan on your house. Because if your company fails, and there is always high risk of failure, more than 50% of companies died in the first year, in general, on average, in OECD countries. So you may run the risk to lose your house. And we think that this is a big barrier for entrepreneurship. So there are some provision in other countries preserving entrepreneurs for experiencing such losses. So we think it's a really important element of business dynamism. Just quickly on taxation and spending. We say that there is not so much room to reduce social spending, for sure, and debt service cost, but still, SOEs is really an important element of the debate. Almost 26% of GDP has been transferred to SOEs since the great financial crisis, if my numbers are correct. So this is huge. And there are some potential important saving to be made there. This is why really we focus on these reforms of SOEs as a way to better control spending. So maybe I'll let the rest of the panel reacting on the other issue. Thank you. Great question.
Phillipe, do you want to
Yes, so
come in before Mamokete has
well,
to tell
on
us?
the inflation targeting to Michael, I think I like to think about inflation when I think about inflation, and when we think about who it affects, the framing is important to me. It's an increase in the cost of living. So it's very often we hide behind this word inflation, which is our nice technical term for it, and everybody in this room understands this quite well. But when we think about it, it's as a cost, it's an increase in the cost of living. And the thing about, and you're quite right, in principle one could deal with it in terms of an exchange rate or rand that depreciates, but that is almost the textbook case where you think of it like a balloon that is evenly expanding. But of course, what is happening in a country where you have, let's say, higher inflation, is that not everything expands at the same rate all the time, which means that those, let's say, dealerships or traders who trade in high volume, low margin goods, they can be caught out very quickly on the back foot, because a little bit of inflation in their cost, it destroys that low margin very quickly. And that's the one thing. The other thing is, of course, in the exchange rate, yes, but the variability is again the thing that catches you out. If you trade, if you export stuff, and again the exchange rate it's not an even expansion, then you're caught up very quickly. So in that sense, you need to go, and that's what I think, the basic definition of, you talk about an inflation target that is low enough so that it doesn't affect the decision making of people. That is what we're sort of talking about. That people don't need to say, oh, but hang on, let's think about what if we are caught out by cost increasing maybe at 4%, and then the price only goes up by 2%, and then we're messed up. So I think that is the one thing. Okay, the other thing I just quickly want to talk about is, if we talk about the adjustment in inflation, the sacrifice ratios are very often the thing but it's a bivariate thing. It forgets the other things in this relationship. So it's the slope of the curve, but we're talking about expectations that need to move the whole curve. And I think that is what we need to talk about. In that sense, we've seen that energy constraints have put upward pressure on inflation. We see that the deficit is playing that role. So when we talk about bringing the inflation target down to, let's say, 3%, we will also need to talk about what is the fiscal side of this, and there's energy supply side, etc. Quickly on the expenditure, I think there, when we talk about where to cut, so the question is, I frame it often as a front office versus a back office thing. Is it the front end workers? Is it the teachers? Is it the doctors and the nurses? Or do we need to get the back offices more efficient and digitalize, for instance, and get and save labor costs there? I think that is an argument we need to talk about. Last point on informality. South Africa has this low absorption rate of 40%. We talk about the workers who are far away from, yes, they are living on the peripheries. But if you look at the breakdown of labor data, where are, let's say, the discouraged work seekers, you will find that half of them are not even living in cities. Half of them live on what we call deep rural areas, which is just another name for communal land areas. These are the former homelands, and almost 30% of the population still live there. And those, in economics, we very often talk about effective effective demand, but here we're talking about effective labor supply. These are people who are talking about, it's not there, a train will not solve the problem. These are people who live so far away from labor markets, they can't make an effective supply of labor. They're not even in the labor market effectively. And about half of the discouraged work seekers live there, because the labor absorption rate on communal land areas is less than 20%. So it's very, very low. And that is also something that we need to look at when we talk about, how do we create sustainable livelihoods on such land, and not just go the traditional way of saying, yes, but we need to dish out private property rights. No, there's a way more complex debate than that. But that is a dimension that we do not often talk about when we talk about labor market reform.
Mamokete, you want to say anything about the exchange rate?
Yeah, so I have a question for the people who are on the panel and in the room. Which links to the one you asked first, your first comment, which was to say all of these problems that we're talking about are downstream of low growth. We've got at the moment, the administration has got OV, we had OV1, first administration, we now have OV2. And I'd like to ask the question, is this the very best we can do in terms of growing or pushing the growth agenda forward? If there's anything we need to be putting as much of our energy behind as we possibly can, surely this is it. Are we doing the best we can do? And I'm asking the question because my sense is that we're not. And it's interesting that linked with the chapter on labor absorption and a few of the charts that were shared there, some of which I had never seen personally. Things like if you look at the legislative burden on businesses, some of which constrains, people or informal businesses, etc. Some of these things don't look like they'd be politically that hard to do. And it'd be interesting to understand what is the real constraint. There's certain things about the way the structure, like our economy works, that make it really hard to address some of these issues. The spatial issue you've just mentioned is one. But surely there must be some easy win somewhere. Like, I don't know. Electricity was a very important reform, but that was a difficult one for obvious reasons. Logistics is a difficult one for obvious reasons. But I just don't feel like there's the energy and the intensity that we need to have, and the line by line criticism that we have for National Treasury in the room. I mean, National Treasury is like, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing this, you're doing that. I don't know if we apply quite the same energy to the growth agenda as all of that. But anyway, so that was my question. And then I suppose if somebody could answer Andrea's question, I'd also be super interested, because I also don't understand that. Why is labor efficiency basically disappeared to zero within that equation on potential growth? Then on Michael's, question, I think that it was largely answered by Phillipe, but the one thing I would like to emphasize is that if it worked to target the real exchange rates over the long term, countries would do it. The reason people don't do it is because it doesn't work. All it does is facilitate the buildup of inefficiencies in the system. It encourages misallocation of capital. It makes it really, really hard for people to make business decisions. It adds a layer of risk premium to everything that everybody does. It does not work. So I would like to say that one is we need to put it aside. It's not an option. But we can obviously have a discussion about what does financial, what does currency stability look like? And it is important to have that currency stability. We cannot rely on nominal variations to get us out of trouble.
So there is the last outstanding question, which is the labor productivity question, and then we should go to lunch.
Although I think you're better placed to answer it, I will just say that we've published. One is the head of the Treasury is here, the acting head of the Treasury is here, and so we'll be able to answer your questions when we get to. Just to give her a heart attack. I did want to say that we've published a macro review as well, Andrea, and in some of those discussions, we go into particularly from a fiscal side, what's happened with the state-owned companies, and certainly the cost, you've talked about the cost that state-owned companies have imposed on fiscal policy. We've tried, when Michael was head of the budget office, to actually talk about the role that state-owned companies play in terms of economic performance. But of course, it's just become a discussion of fiscal risk more recently, and the cost that they impose on the public finances. And I think the macro review goes into some of those themes as well. But maybe you have a much better answer than I have on that question.
Okay, just on. Thank you very much, and my apologies to you, Anthony, for hijacking your session. But Khetha invoked me, and I wanted to make this clarification very quickly. The head of the Treasury is a much braver, much wiser man than I am a person. His name is Duncan, and he's very much in his job. Khetha's trolling me because I had the pronounced misfortune of having to act in his stead last week. But I think, Andre and Mamokete, the question you ask is an excellent one, and I think it reflects something that we've been trying to grapple with, and this is kind of where our thinking is going. Because productivity is generally unobservable, to the extent that you're in a situation where you're technically increasing capital stock through a whole host of things, and admittedly through large-scale public sector projects, but aren't getting the economic services that come with it, necessarily your equation moves, right? So you're not necessarily shedding jobs en masse. You're technically increasing your built infrastructure to provide economic services. Those economic services aren't coming online. Potential isn't moving in the right direction. By default, total factor productivity adjusts. And I think that may be where part of the answer sits, right? So you are doing things that technically should be putting you on a higher growth trajectory, but you're not getting the economic services that come with it. And I think part of it then relates to your observation, Phillipe, around the front office and the back office. And I think a big part of the conversation on the back office, even from a consolidation and its appropriacy perspective, speaks to the efficacy of spend, right? So to the extent that you're allocating all of these resources to frontline services, be they health, be they education, etc., and we know for a fact that, for instance, South Africa punches well above its weight in relation to the amount of money we allocate to education, the amount of money, and also the quality of service according to previous OECD services that we provide in healthcare even, something isn't adding up. We put the money there. The things we're getting back from the money suggest that something fundamentally isn't working, and that might be speaking to why it is that we're seeing these strange total factor productivity outcomes that don't necessarily factor reality. So I think there's something to be said about the importance of the efficacy of spend. The final thing that I'll say, and it comes to your first question, Anthony, regarding sort of this relationship between growth and the macro fiscal position, is that one of the things that we struggle the most to communicate, and I think that the panel as well probably empathizes because they find themselves in the situation consistently, is sort of like this relationship that these two things have together. Growth doesn't happen in isolation of macro fiscal choices. Macro fiscal choices don't happen in isolation of growth. And you have this sort of you have a mutually reinforcing relationship. So you either have these vicious or virtuous cycles. And I think the big thing that we have been contending with is this idea of how you go about making really difficult choices, to your point, Michael, about consolidation, its nature and its incidence in an environment where you've got these low growth outcomes, but you need to be reducing the cost of capital, not just on the short end, but in the long end, to your point, Mamokete, about sort of funding on the yield curve. How do you bring down that risk premium in a way that still allows you to facilitate economic activity in a way that crowds in private sector investment? And I think one of the most difficult jobs that certainly I've had as trying to articulate the macro fiscal strategy is in always reminding our audience that these things are related, right? It's long, slow, painful work. Not just the communication of it, but the actual work of doing it. To your point, Mamokete, are we doing enough for growth? Probably not. But there are very few silver bullets left. All the stuff we've got to do now is difficult. All the stuff we've got to do now is heavy lifting. And I think it's about consistently getting that message across the line. So my apologies for the lengthy intervention, Anthony, but I thought those questions were really helpful triggers, and just to reflect that we were grappling with them as well. Thank you.
I think I'm going to cut it there because we are late. But that was fascinating and useful. Just a reminder, if you're going to quote anybody anywhere, please just check first. But other than that, thank you to the panel. Thank you to the OECD for the very thorough and comprehensive. I mean, it's a very comprehensive report that covers a lot of ground and shows many challenges that we face with some very good recommendations. So thank you for that.